Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series podcast. Our guest for this episode is renowned American scholar Graham Allison. Allison is Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard University, founding Dean of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and the former director of its Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Dr. Allison spoke with us about Canada's role in the world and how we can best navigate great power competition between the U.S. and China. We also discussed Allison's famous Thucydides Trap and whether it is appropriate in the modern context and if it is an effective lens to understand the U.S.-China rivalry. We also discussed the war in Ukraine and Allison's predictions for how the conflict will end. Dr. Allison, it's such a privilege to host you today. Thanks for taking time to speak with the CDA Institute. What advice might you have for a middle power like Canada when it comes to both dealing with China and navigating competition between China and our greatest ally, the United States?
Well, Canada is a wonderful player to try to, put yourself in the position of it and think about as a middle power who's so close to the U.S. that it has to be substantially deferential. And indeed, I'm even familiar with Canadian history in which there's still some disputes about how we came to own the fat tail of Alaska. And actually, I believe we stole it fair and square. But if you go to the Canadian History Museum, there's a very good account, I think, and very fair account of how Teddy Roosevelt basically seized some territory and looked at Vancouver and thought about it. Okay, so on the other hand, you have thick relations with China, and you have very thick relations with Europe, including with Great Britain. So Canada is a unique, wonderfully complicated set of connections. I think secondly, and this, I believe Canadians are so modest, too modest, I would say, that they don't appreciate the extent to which they can contribute intellectually and create it in statecraft, as well as being a player. So it's not by accident. Canada is part of many clubs, okay, many high-level clubs. But if you say, well, how often do the Canadians undertake an initiative? Well, in some sense, the G20 may have been a Canadian initiative, which was an interesting one. But I would say in trying to think about U.S. relations with China or China's place in the world, there's certainly no monopoly of wisdom in Washington, and there's no monopoly of wisdom in Beijing. So there's no reason why Canada, having serious relations with each, can't play some more constructive role. And I think if one needed inspiration for that, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, was in a little city-state, 6 million people. Who asked him why, to have any views about geopolitics and great powers in the world? Which the answer is, well, he just began to think, and then he had some views, and then pretty soon people listened and said, wow, that's pretty interesting. And then one thing led to the other, and pretty soon people were seeking him out. I mean, as a person of strategic insight. So I would say, again, that's why institutes like yours and groups in Canada should not be shy about thinking, okay, let's see what ideas we have. And then for playing your hand, I think one's got to always start with what are my relative capabilities as I play with the other parties. But Canada has strong relations with Europe, has a major role in NATO, has a sort of integrated role with the U.S., has deep economic ties with China, has lots of actually Chinese Canadians. And I think that that means it'll be difficult, and you'll get stretched between the two from time to time, and each will make unreasonable demands, and you'll have to, weave your way. But I think there's a space for in this arena, and I think Canadians are more likely to see the issues holistically than Americans. Americans, as you know, are solipsistic, solipsists. So we basically think that we the only thing exists, and we declare and do things, and everything falls into place according to our will. Or H.R. McMaster calls it strategic narcissism. So we just think that that we act, other people accept, okay? As opposed to asking, how does this create incentives and disincentives for other parties? And I think we also tend to think too often of the military instrument as the lead, as opposed to a broader picture. So if the U.S. and China are going to survive and find a way to not get caught in Thucydides trap, they're going to have to recognize that on the one hand, this is the fiercest rivalry with the most formidable rivals of all times. So that's half. But that's only half of the picture. The other half is they're each states on a very small globe. And they each have nuclear arsenals that could destroy each other. And even more, we now understand they each emit greenhouse gases into the same enclosed biosphere, in which either by itself can make it uninhabitable for both. So they have to find some way to coexist or to cooperate to avoid co-destructing while competing in a fierce rivalry. Well, that sounds like a contradiction. Sort of is a contradiction. But F. Scott Fitzgerald, the guy that wrote The Great Gatsby, had this good line that the test of a first-class mind is to be able to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time and still function. That test for an individual, whether a state could be that smart, I don't know, but that's what's going to be required. I think Canada could play a role in helping articulate something like that.
How has the U.S.-China diplomatic rivalry evolved during the 21st century as China has emerged as a dominant economic power? And how has China's diplomatic playbook evolved over the past 2 decades?
So this is a topic about which I wrote a book that was published just as Trump became president, now 5 years ago. It had a big idea, Thucydides Trap, an idea that actually Thucydides had about 2,500 years ago. And all I was doing was trying to coin a term to make it vivid as a way to illuminate what we're seeing in the relationship between the U.S. and China. But basically, the central idea is that when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens to overtake a major ruling power, fasten your seatbelts, turbulence ahead, most often, in 12 of the 16 cases of the last 500 years, war. So is China a rapidly rising power? Duh. Who can argue otherwise? There's now a few people trying to make some arguments, but they're pretty poor gruel. Okay, is the U.S. a colossal ruling power? Oh no, Americans, we're not really. Of course it is. Will the defining issue for the rest of our professional lifetimes be the impact of this unprecedentedly meteoric rise in more dimensions and faster than ever seen in history on what was actually, what has been the most global power, certainly since Rome, and a power who's created an international order that actually has allowed us more than 7 decades without great power war. So this is all the stuff of what Thucydides would say is the grandest, rivalry of all times. And I was asked at Davos this year, so what would Thucydides say now? I said, well, briefly, he would say, everybody seems to be entirely unscripted, even as if they were trying to see which could better exemplify the role of the rising power and the ruling power. and he's on the edge of his seat watching for the grandest collision of all times.
Some scholars have criticisms of the Thucydides Trap and its application to the US-China rivalry. Richard Hanania said China's ambitions are limited to combating internal issues and that it doesn't pose a threat to US interests. Lawrence Friedman has echoed the sentiment, saying China is interested in its regional position. Others have asserted that China is too weak for such a conflict and that the Thucydides Trap misdiagnoses where China finds itself in its development arc. How might you respond to some of these criticisms, and is the Thucydides Trap applicable to the modern era?
Well, I think each one is by a serious person, and each deserves to be addressed individually. But let me start again with the big picture. In fact, for your since you're a research institute, we have now just in the last 6 months published 4 major reports on what I think I'm going to call the GOAT rivalry. I don't know whether you do GOAT in Canada or not, but greatest of all times. So basically, we have one chapter on the great military rivalry, and one on the great economic rivalry, and one on the great technology rivalry, and one on the great diplomatic rivalry. Each of these starts with a snapshot of China in 2000, and then takes a picture of China in 2021, and then summarizes and collects the best sources of evidence about the path between 2000 and 2021. So any attempt to argue that China is not a meteoric rising power flies in the face of all of the evidence. In the year 2000, China was a poor, struggling country, struggling to get into the WTO. Today, look at the CIA website. Who's the largest economy in the world? By their measure, purchasing power, China. So if you look at any graph, it goes like this, okay? So, okay, I would say. So anybody trying to deny that is just denying the facts. Second point, does China have only regional ambitions? And I think, again, I addressed that in the book by quoting the world's most astute China watcher, until he died a couple of years ago, Lee Kuan Yew. So he was a person who obviously watched extremely closely because the survival of Singapore depends on what's happening there. He knew every Chinese leader. They spent huge amounts of time, including Xi, talking to him because they wanted to see how did he make this little Singapore miracle, work. And I wrote a book with Blackwell, basically, in which we asked the questions and Lee Kuan Yew does the answers. So I asked him, I said, some people say that China, that Xi aspires to displace the U.S. as a predominant power in Asia in his lifetime. What would you say to that? He looked at me and sort of smiled like, oh, he said, of course. Why not? How could they not aspire to be number one in Asia and in time beyond? So is it correct that China is mainly about China? Yes. China is mainly about restoring China's greatness as they understand it? Yes. Is that primarily, in the first instance, local? Yes. But is it also regional for Asia? I mean, ask anybody in Singapore or Taiwan or Japan or South Korea or Vietnam. So is it therefore broader regional? I think yes. And while I think their primary interest more globally is in a permissive environment for allowing them to achieve all they can be at home in the first instance, that where they will want to go after 2049, which is their current time horizon, nobody knows. But as Xi Jinping has said, about 2049, by then, he hopes China will be as wealthy as other advanced countries. Well, since they have 4 times as many citizens, if they have the same per capita as the U.S., that's a GDP that could be 4 times as large as U.S., and that they'll move to, quote, center stage in international relations. I don't imagine that they're the Soviet Union. They have no ambition, I think, to take over other countries and have them ruled by Chinese, or they don't have any illusion. In fact, they're, as Henry Kissinger has pointed out very well, both they and Americans have this huge superiority complex. In the American case, we just believe we're the best and everybody really wants to be like us. Okay? But for Chinese, they believe, of course, they're the best, but they believe nobody is good enough to even approximate being like them. So they appreciate if people try a little bit, but they don't expect they'll ever be good enough to do so. So I think that's with respect to that. On the efforts to argue, and I think Friedman has tried to do this as well, that China's only, or that China's too weak to be a serious Thucydidean rivalry. I would say, watch its strength grow. And if I look at their military capability, which is what he's talking about, while the U.S. remains unquestionably the most powerful military nation in the world, along China's periphery and in the adjacent seas, the military balance of power has changed dramatically over the last 22 years. So if you look at the scenario in which in 1996, when I was in the Pentagon, China was intimidating Taiwan with missile tests, and the U.S. brought 2 carriers up to the region to force them to back down, that scenario is impossible for the U.S. today, because if you brought carriers that close to the mainland, they would be vulnerable to being sunk. So the military balance locally has changed significantly. That does not mean that they have global ambitions in the first instance for being a global power replacing the U.S. or whatever, but a Thucydidean rival who wants to be predominant in Asia, where Americans believe we're also a major Asian power. Hawaii is in the Pacific. Guam is very close to, and Japan and Australia and South Korea are important allies of the U.S. So I would say it's pretty hard to argue that this is not the right lens for illuminating what we're actually seeing.
I'm wondering if you can get into what the relationship between the war in Ukraine, the emerging alignment between Russia and China, and the great power rivalry between Beijing and Washington is. How might the outcomes of the war thus far impact China's calculations about military action over Taiwan?
If anybody had failed to recognize the emerging alliance between China and Russia, there's no better spotlight than the war in Ukraine. So now I've been trying to present this argument for 5 years, and have argued in writing for 5 years that this is the most important undeclared alliance in the world. That what Xi Jinping has done in building this relationship with Russia, and in this instance, since you have 2 leaders who think they're going to be there for a long time, and who have been there for a long time, ever since 2012, when he became president, his first visit was to Moscow. The first person he talks to in any of these settings is Putin. The first person who pops up in any meeting, which he does, is after he gives his speech, like at the Olympics, Putin gives his speech. At the meeting of the Shanghai cooperation group that'll occur next month, there'll be first Xi and then Putin. So basically, this is a thick relationship on 10 dimensions. I've written about that in a national interest piece that you could probably look at if you're interested in more details. And therefore, when the question arose, where would China be if Russia invaded Ukraine? I wrote a piece that actually offered people 10-to-1 odds that it was going to be giving Xi his full backing. And I won some money in Washington with that bet. So basically, we can now see what they did and see what they're doing. That's number one. Number two, should somebody as smart as Xi and his generals be concerned watching Russia's poor performance in this war against Ukraine? And I would say I hope so. I think so. I mean, I certainly would be. So what they thought was going to be a quick coup didn't occur. A formidable military force in which they had invested a lot in modernizing it, put on a very poor showing, certainly in the first innings. Their ability to integrate land-air war, the equipment underperformed. So you'd look and say, how's my client doing here? Not as well as I would expect. And secondly, we bought a lot of his equipment. I hope that it's poor maintenance rather than, but I have to look at that again. And then we hadn't really thought about how complicated integrated military operations are. But if you're trying to integrate air, sea, land, intelligence, you haven't been practicing that a lot, you better go back and practice some more. So I think there's at least, again, 10 reasons why a serious watcher in Beijing would look at this and say, well, these are things that give me a little more reservation about what we're capable to do if we were to decide to, or were forced to choose to attack Taiwan. And I'm sure they're studying this. The Chinese military, more seriously than any other military in the world, study the wars of other parties and try to understand what's happening and understand the dynamics and the lessons. So I'm sure they're following this closely.
You've said that ultimately we're going to have to negotiate with Putin in the end, just as we did with Stalin and Mao. Do you stand by this assessment, and what do you think such a negotiation would look like or result in?
Well, the answer is yes. The idea that you have to deal with the devil comes from international relations, and we've seen it multiple times historically. Now, there may be some devils that are so horrible that you basically have to do them in total war. Hitler being for example. But in the case of Japan, the U.S. ended up negotiating with Japan. The emperor remained the emperor, even though the U.S. imposed a virtual total surrender. And most wars are not total surrender wars, and this is certainly unlikely to be. That's first point. Second, the point that most people watching don't want to acknowledge, but that I think is absolutely fundamental, is that if events on the battlefield force Putin to choose between a humiliating loss on the one hand and escalating the level of destruction up to and including tactical nuclear weapon strikes on Ukrainian targets, I'm given 5-1 odds he chooses the latter. So the idea that he could suffer a humiliating loss and survive in Russia is very low. So for him, this is existential. It's all about him and all of his vision of Russia. And he has the capability to act if that's his last choice. So I think, therefore, even though Zelensky can't readily say so, he can't even really admit this, I think, to himself, and I wouldn't expect that he would. But certainly Biden has figured this out, and most of the Europeans have figured this out, that somehow, why is it, for all that we say about the stakes in Ukraine, there's no Canadians there fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians, or Americans, or Germans, or British? Why is that? And as Biden has said, we are not going to fight World War III over Ukraine, because worse than the atrocities that Putin has visited on Ukraine would be all those atrocities plus similar atrocities on Germany and Canada and America. So we're not going to have a war with Russia if we can avoid it. And why is that? It's because of this terrible old hangover from the Cold War that didn't go away, but you're familiar with it. Unfortunately, most young people today, actually most people in positions of authority, don't feel it or don't understand it. We live under a specter of mutual assured destruction. So we live in a mad world. So what does that mean? That means that you and I each have arsenals of nuclear weapons, such that if I do my very best to attack you and disarm you and destroy you, I can succeed in destroying you, but not without triggering a retaliatory attack upon me that destroys me, my society. And I think, wait a minute, let me do this one again. So if I go to war with them, even though I have the greatest military in the world, and even though we kill every last one of them, I still, at the end of this story, have lost my own society. It's also been destroyed. So Ronald Reagan helped people ponder that, and then created this wonderful, bumper sticker in which he said, a nuclear war cannot be won, because if at the end of the war, our society's been destroyed, don't come telling me that you won. You succeeded in killing the adversary. Good, that was good. But at the cost of destroying our society? No, that's not victory. So a nuclear war cannot be won. And then the big imperative, and must therefore never be fought. So what that requires is is constraints, even self-constraints, on the greatest military force in the world in dealing with another force that it can't defeat and destroy without risking the destruction of its own society. So therefore, I wish and pray that Putin is struck by lightning. I would be happy for a terrible disease to break out and all the Putinistas to fall over tomorrow. If somebody had a chain that I could pull and they went away, I would pull it and flush, let them go. But absent that, he will remain as certainly the commander of a superpower nuclear arsenal as certainly as the leaders of the evil empire did. And so we're going to have to find some way to, survive with them. And I think that means that wherever this war stops, and it could be a stalemate approximately where it is now, it could be 100 kilometers or a couple hundred kilometers either to the west or to the east, but somewhere around there, I suspect we'll get to something like a stalemate. It won't be a permanent solution. Ukraine will never give up its claim to recover all its territory, nor should it. But in the same way that after, if you remember back in 2014, Putin seized Crimea and a couple of chunks of Luhansk and Donetsk, and it was fighting for a year, and then basically petered out, and it was just low-level, conflict across a line of control for the period from 2016 till 2022. So I would think maybe we get back to something like that. And during that period, you could imagine a negotiated ceasefire, or it could just be implicit. But in any case, there'll end up being negotiations of the sort that, how many times has Macron talked to Putin in the period since the invasion? Answer, 22. So he's talking to him about, how could one possibly get this to some stopping point? And I'm very eager to support stopping the killing as soon as we can, because I don't think that whether the Ukraine gets back 100 kilometers or loses another 100 kilometers. That's not the long-run picture for Ukraine. The long-run picture for Ukraine is for Zelensky and the Ukrainians who've been absolutely amazing, and their capital in Kiev and the rest of the country that they control to build a successful country. I mean, that's going to be a much bigger challenge than preventing the Russians from erasing them. They hadn't been doing a very good job before the Russians came. They got a very big challenge, but they have a very big claim, moral and political, on the West to provide all the support we can to give them a chance to build a society. And I have said to many Ukrainians, this is a fantastic challenge, well, great opportunity. And if you turn out to be the West Germany to East Germany, or the South Korea to North Korea, in time, you're going to recover everything and maybe more. So, make a society that works. And I'd say get to a stopping point sooner rather than later, because what I don't want is my nightmare of Putin conducting a nuclear strike on Ukraine, and then another one, and then we wonder, oh my God, what kind of a world do we live in?